The M4 Sherman tank became the workhorse of Allied armour during World War II. As the conflict became all-enveloping, the Allies geared up for mass production, and the Sherman tank typified the weapon of an industrial war. The American-manufactured M4 was adopted by the Allies as the basic medium tank and saw action in nearly all theatres of World War II. It also went on to be used by other nations after the war for many years in different guises. It was often outgunned, certainly under-armoured, and not always well used. But it was always there, good enough to do most jobs and be there in numbers. The Sherman helped Montgomery and his 8th Army win the Battle of El Alamein, and in conjunction with his new American allies, push Rommel out of North Africa. It also was instrumental in the amphibious landings of Sicily and up through the rugged terrain of Italy. Shermans fought alongside the T-34 on the Russian steppes in some of the largest tank battles of all time. From the D-Day landing beaches in Normandy, the Sherman fought hedgerow by hedgerow through the countryside and towns of Northern Europe to Berlin. In the Pacific, the American Marines fought alongside Shermans as they island hopped their way to final victory against Japan. The story of the Sherman tank is as much about production as it is about design and operation. The painful lessons of the BEF early in the war showed alarming deficiencies in British armour, its reliability, firepower and deployment. British manufacturing was simply not capable of producing the numbers of tanks required to take the fight to the enemy. The alarm bells being rung in Europe were at first ignored by many in mainland USA. The Battle of Britain had been won by a narrow margin. She had preserved her freedom and was now fighting for her life alone against the vastly superior military force of the fascist Third Reich. In contrast to the present-day position of the United States, the late 1930s saw the US military as a fragmented, reactionary force with little inclination to improve its status. Even as late as 1939, we find the US still very short of men and still equipped with antiquated weapons. Its active army strength was approximately 170,000 men, 42,000 of whom were stationed overseas. The 7th Cavalry were the only mechanized full brigade. There was strong support for the isolationist theory, a hideous memory of the slaughter of the trenches, and a feeling that this was Europe's own mess and our boys were not going to be shipped out again to help sort it out. This lack of imperative progress was extremely evident in the development of the tank. Based on Great War practices, the role of the tank in the USA was defined by the General Staff in 1920 as being able to facilitate the uninterrupted advance of the rifleman in attack. This resulted in two main types, the light and medium tanks, limited to 5 and 15 tons respectively. The tight treasury budget of the 1920s allowed only restricted development, and as a result, only the T1 tank really came to fruition, which was designated the M1 in the early spring of 1928. Production and design of these tanks was undertaken by the US Army's own arms factory, the Rock Island Arsenal. For the initial low numbers of 20s and 30s commissioned, Rock Island was perfectly placed. The Blitzkrieg in Europe, followed by the evacuation of the BEF at Dunkirk and the rapid fall of France, changed US Army perspectives for good. Two major forces now spurred on tank production and development. The British need for armour to carry on the war, and the American realisation that isolation was no longer a real option, and re-equipment of its armed forces an absolute necessity. The production facility at Rock Island simply could not cope with the numbers required. Plans under discussion called for production to be outsourced to companies familiar with heavy machinery, large bulky product, and capable of assembling components into completed items quickly and efficiently. America looked to its already successful mass manufacturers in the automobile and locomotive industry. After hurried consultation in June 1940, K.T. Keller of the Chrysler Corporation went from agreement in principle to build tanks for the US military to receiving orders for 1,000 M2A1 tanks to be delivered by August 1942. To aid output, the new Detroit tank arsenal was to be completed and ready for production by September 1941. Production levels were set to rise from 3 tanks to 100 per month. The great production race seemed to have begun, but only 13 days later, the contract for M2s was cancelled. Concerns about the power of the German Panzer's guns and thick armour dictated that a 75mm gun and increased armour was to be standard for all American medium tanks. A major flaw in the production of a tank to meet these specifications was that no fully traversing turret had yet been designed in the US to take a powerful weapon like the 75mm. However, the howitzer version of the M2 variant had successfully worked with a large gun mounted in a side sponson, and the experience gained meant that production could begin immediately. This was quickly designated the M3. Hence, the contract for Chrysler to build 1,000 M2s was cancelled almost as soon as it was delivered, and a new contract given to produce a like number of M3 mediums. It is no exaggeration to say that the production process was begun before the product designs were complete. Lend-Lease had not yet been established as a means of payment. The British were entreated to buy their tanks on a strictly cash-and-carry basis. For both the British and American forces, the M3 provided a suitable interim design and was deliverable. The sheer numbers of tanks predicted to be required by the new US armoured force and the British meant orders rose sharply. The newly formed Joint Tank Planning Committee almost immediately began making plans for 1,000 tanks per month in April 1941, doubling that number by July. In December of that year, the surprise attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor threw America into the war.
We will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
The Lend-Lease arrangement between Britain and America came into being. Churchill and Beaverbrook met with Roosevelt and looked to set medium tank production figures at 25,000 in 1942 and 45,000 in 1943. Meanwhile, 4 US manufacturing giants had begun production of the M3, known as the Lee by the Americans and the Grant by the British. The main companies, Pullman Standard Car Company, Detroit Tank Arsenal, Prest Steel Car Company, and the American Locomotive Company, had by August 1942 produced nearly 5,000 M3s for US and British forces. It was recognized by the US Chiefs of Staff that this conflict was going to become all-enveloping, and that the US Army would have to fight in several theatres of war, with as much materiel as it could muster. Producing a super tank would not be practical. There was simply not enough time. They had to produce a machine that would be speedily available and do most of the things required of it adequately. As the M3 swung into production, work was being pursued at breakneck speed on its successor, the M4. The choice of engines for this vehicle was vital. They had to be powerful and reliable, but mostly they had to be available. The American Air Force, Navy and automobile industry had developed several power plants for use in their aircraft, trucks and boats. These could be harnessed to the new design, and as no new innovations were required, could be manufactured in great numbers. This set the design criteria, giving the M4 a very high profile, especially with the air-cooled radial right Cyclone and Continental engines. The basic design was progressed from the M3 lower hull, using similar suspension units, transmission units and track layout. The major difference being the addition of the fully traversing turret. This one-piece cast item could now be manufactured, and the top deck of the hull made strong enough to support it and its heavy 75mm gun. To help illustrate some points, we've tracked down a Canadian Sherman tank that has been restored by its owner. The huge engine bay that had to accommodate the different power plants looks cavernous close up and accounts for the overall high profile of the vehicle. A quite daunting height for the exposed head of a tank commander. The hull is a one-piece casting bolted to one of the many different types of M4 transmission noses. Behind the glasses plates sat the driver and machine gunner. The thickness of the armour here is what protected them against the German 75mm, or even worse, the dreaded 88mm. Inside is where the turret basket hangs, letting the gunner, loader and commander swing round with a gun. It's claustrophobic, noisy, smelly and very dangerous. With a highly inflammable engine behind you, surrounded by rows of your own ammunition, and only 5 centimeters of steel to protect you from armor-piercing shells, it's easy to feel very, very uncomfortable. Especially when you know that the enemy has a bigger gun than you and is probably lining you up in his sights right now. When the Lend-Lease agreement came into being, the first M4s are diverted from the US 1st Armoured Corps to the British in North Africa. Their deployment at El Alamein alongside the 8th Army's Grants, where they were initially referred to as Swallows, gave the British their first victory of the war and turned the tide of Axis advance. At last, the British had a tank with which they could match the enemy Panzer IIIs and IVs. The top speed of the M4, around 25 miles an hour, was much appreciated by the British tankers, as was the rotating speed of the electrically powered turret, giving the crew a distinct advantage in tank-to-tank engagements. After its first baptism of fire, the M4 was beginning to prove itself a valuable addition to the armoury of the Allied forces as they pushed Hitler's much-vaunted Africa Corps off the open spaces of the desert battlefield. The arsenal of democracy began increasing production of M4s from different factories in the US. Factories produced almost 50,000 M4s between December 1940 and July 1945. At its height, one Sherman was being produced every 30 minutes to satisfy the needs of the expanding Allied armies as they began to wage war on many fronts around the world. The American motor industry swapped its production of country sedans for the harsh world of military hardware, often making great use of female labour as the men increasingly were shipped overseas to fight in the tanks rolling off the production lines. The M4s continued to roll off the production line, usually painted in pristine US olive drab, as it was impossible to predict in which theatre of war they would see action. As soon as the vehicles were in the field, however, necessity and the natural urge of self-preservation meant that local camouflage painting was applied. In North Africa, some units used broad black bands to help break up the tank's profile. Others favoured the red or yellow earth banding. These colours tended to fade quickly under the desert sun and dust. In parts of Tunisia and later Italy, where the Shermans were required to operate in olive groves and orchards, or across rocky and sandy ground, more imaginative camouflage patterns were employed. This helped disguise the high profile of the Sherman as they assaulted enemy positions. During the winter, when snow fell heavily in Europe, American and British tankers hurriedly daubed their Shermans with whitewash to try and conceal them from enemy anti-tank guns. As the Allies began their assault upon the supposedly soft underbelly of Europe, the M4 was in the vanguard of most actions and came up against stiffening German resistance through Sicily and later in Italy. The initial momentum of the campaign slowed to a desperate crawl as the Allies slogged their way forward, valley by valley, against a well-dug-in and fortified Axis enemy. German and Italian troops could look down from their hilltop defences and bring down heavy fire on the assembling Allied forces below. There is no doubt that the M4 was under-armoured. 5 centimetres of armour would not stop a German 75mm at even 2,500 yards. This often led to the lead tanks in a troop being brewed up in a matter of minutes by a well-sighted anti-tank gun, or a Tiger with its 88mm, well before the enemy were even spotted. To aid the Soviet forces defending their homeland, the Lend-Lease arrangement was extended to Russia. The deficiencies of the Sherman were demonstrated in the slaughter on the Russian battlefields. Large formations of Shermans and T-34s, also mass-produced in great numbers, were pulverized by the better guns and armor of the numerically smaller German units and the feared Tiger tanks. The mass production capacity of factories in Russia and America were the only way the Allies could sustain their losses to win this apocalyptic struggle of attrition. As the war in the East took its bloody course, the Allies opened a second front, and on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, invaded France, landing thousands of men and machines on the beaches of Normandy. The Sherman was instrumental in the landings themselves, and the ingenious adaptation of armour by the British served the purpose well, assaulting the German defences and breaking through the hard crust of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. More and more armour was brought in when the Mulberry Harbours were established. Getting the tanks ashore was a top priority to deal with the forthcoming battles. M4s were waterproofed in a variety of ways to protect against the Channel surf if the LSTs could not get in close enough to shore. Regiments of the British armies in the east fought with their Shermans through the bocage country around Caen. Every field, farmhouse and hedgerow became a fortified obstacle, forcing the Allies to be constantly on the attack. The American forces in the west encountered similar problems with the impenetrable hedgerow country. The Germans were experts in reactive defence, and every yard of ground was contested bitterly. The fields were crisscrossed by murderous machine gun fire. Anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts were able to brew up Shermans from unseen positions, and then regroup at another hidden strong point to attack again. Often, one heavily armoured and well-camouflaged German tank would destroy several Shermans in a matter of minutes, as the Allied tankers found themselves hemmed in by the narrow lanes, unable to manoeuvre. The only option was to retire quickly, and call up the artillery or the air force, and in some cases the big guns of the battleships still anchored offshore. M4s were sometimes fitted with a Cullen device, a kind of plough fitted to the front of the tank, designed to gouge out gaps in the tangled hedgerows and allow some freedom of movement. Frequently, the first one through the gap was the first casualty. armour was used in troops of 4 or 5 tanks, and by necessity began integrating closely with the infantry and other branches of the services. Advances were often measured in yards as the Allies fought their way field by field, village by village, to break out from their beachhead. The Battle of Normandy became a sustained, grinding battle of nerves, straining men and machines to the limit. To help us with our telling of the Sherman story, we enlisted the help of some World War II reenactment groups and a restored late-war Canadian Sherman. Throughout the Battle of Normandy, cautiously advancing British and American infantry in the woods and lanes used the Shermans as close support to help clear out German infantry that had been outflanked by an armoured thrust, but still posed a credible threat to the Allies. Liaison between tank crews and infantry was at first poor. Communication was limited often to banging on the side of the machine from the outside with an entrenching tool and shouting up to the commander over the noise of the engine and battle. Later in the war, a telephone system was installed at the rear of the tank so that infantry officers could communicate directly with the commander of the tank and others in the group. Even inside the noisy machine, Sherman crews often heard the rattle of machine guns against their hulls and the screams of the shot-up infantry as a hidden German gun post ripped the air with murderous Spandau fire. The pace of demand meant that as soon as the first M4s were put into production, modifications were made. This practice of mix and match by necessity makes post-war classifying and identification of Sherman tanks a real difficulty for historians. The redesigns, new construction processes and more manufacturers further complicated accurate identification, as did the frequent field modifications and repairs. Manufacturing of the hull was split between 2 main types: the rolled steel sections welded together, shown here as the M4A2, or the fully cast hull, shown here as the M4A1. The cast hulls supposedly gave better protection with their curving, sloped steel, but could not be produced in great numbers. The upper and lower hulls were joined at the nose by various transmission covers, all developed from the earlier M3, but changed at various times to cover model changes, upgrades and manufacturers' supply situations. Models such as the M4, M4A1, M4A2, M4A4 all shared many similar components, such as running wheels and bogies, and quite often these would be swapped across in assembly, as well as in the field, as necessity overrode any neatly ordered production schedule. Engines used in the M4 and M4A1 included the 9-cylinder radial right Cyclone and Continental, both also power plants for bombers and fighters. Another similar design, the M4A2, incorporated twin General Motors diesels, which were not popular with the petrol-driven US Army, but were favoured by the US Marines in the Pacific, as most of their marine equipment was diesel-powered. Many were also used by British and Commonwealth troops. The 500 horsepower V8 built by Ford was originally developed to be used in aircraft, but diverted to tank production. This engine was easy to maintain and proved very popular with US troops, as it made the M4A3 a very fast machine indeed. Again, drawing on existing resources, as more radial engines were being used by the Air Force, Chrysler mated 5 of its 6-cylinder petrol engines to a common crankshaft and produced the Chrysler Multibank, a powerful but maintenance-intensive variant called the M4A4, which was not popular with the US Army units and was shipped across to be used by the British. The M4A6 used the development of the Caterpillar diesel or multi-fuel engine. Due to the huge figures required and the consequent number of manufacturers involved, the different types of M4 produced were not always design improvements, they were often in response to a change in availability of parts or engines. As all M4 hulls were notoriously thin, about 5 centimeters, the field practice of using appliqué armor to protect vital areas became widely accepted by the crews, sometimes quite overtly, and attracted criticism from some superior officers. The most enduring hull shape of the Sherman was the M4A4. Sadly, one common feature of the engines used was that they easily caught fire, earning the nickname Tommykooker from the Germans and Ronson by the British. The nervousness of the crews was understandable, as they knew that the next hit from an unseen foe could penetrate their armor and the AP round would kill or maim them, as well as igniting the internal ammunition, condemning all inside to a horrible death. The escape hatches are small, even allowing for the fact that a lot of the tank guys were quite wiry. It's difficult to get through one of these, although several veterans have stated that when faced with the immediate prospect of burning alive, they did it in a matter of seconds. The feeling of helplessness caused by the thin armour was compounded by the relatively poor 75mm gun, which, despite its initial welcome as an improvement over the standard British 2-pounder, soon began to demand suicidally close ranges to defeat the newer German tanks. A depressingly constant kill ratio of 15-1 was maintained by German Tiger tanks against the Sherman. In the run-up to D-Day, the highly successful British 17-pounder anti-tank gun was mated with the Sherman. The existing turret had to be cut and reformed, with a large bustle at the rear to accommodate the radio and counterweight displaced by the larger breech of the 17-pounder. As the shells were also longer, the machine gunner's space was given over to ammunition storage. Introduction of the 17-pounder into the Sherman gave it the firepower necessary to take on larger German tanks. But the Firefly could not be produced in sufficient numbers quickly, and it was used as part of a 5-tank troop. It was typically used to hunt down a big German tank or gun emplacement after initial contact had destroyed several leading Shermans and so revealed its position. One British troop was caught up in the action near St Agnon, north of Falaise, where, after a hectic night march, the troop found cover in a local orchard. A small formation of enemy tanks, 3 of the dreaded Tigers, were spotted moving across their field of view, about 1,200 yards away, and immediately the Firefly crew was ordered to target the rear tank of the enemy formation. When the rear Tiger got within 800 yards, the 17-pounder of the Firefly got off 2 shots, penetrating the thick side armour and setting him on fire. The gunner in the Firefly quickly got off another shot, and the second Tiger burst into flames. The first Tiger was trying to find cover when he was hit by 2 more rounds from the Firefly's gun and started to burn. Like all tanks brewing up, explosions caused by the internal ammunition blew the tank into pieces. The action lasted only 12 minutes. Just after this, the Firefly was hit by an unseen round and began to burn, the crew all escaping quickly. It was only later in the Normandy campaign that evidence showed that the lead Tiger was that of Michael Wittmann, the Tiger Ace. A legend had met its end. To help counter the hard-hitting German tanks, the Americans upgunned their Shermans in 1944 with a 76mm cannon. Numbers of this model increased as the war drew on. Not only were there several models of the main tank, more variants were also adapted on the Sherman chassis. Also to deal with the larger German armour, the Americans in 1942 built their M10 tank destroyer with the same 76mm gun. The M10 brought a bigger punch to bear in the battle, but at the expense of thinner armour. This lack of protection and its open-topped turret made it unpopular with certain units, especially in close combat where a well-thrown potato masher could wipe out the entire crew. The swimming DD, or duplex drive, was developed for the D-Day landings. After several designs for a floating tank were trialled, the Allies opted for the high-skirt version, with the propulsion coming from the tracks and twin screws. The canvas and wood skirt which gave it buoyancy was very flimsy, and although many got ashore when launched from their landing craft and were effective against German positions, those that encountered choppy seas or were launched too far out off the D-Day beaches were quickly swamped and sank like a stone. For specialist needs, such as mine clearing, the flailing crab was used by the British in France and Italy to beat the ground ahead of the tank, exploding hidden mines in a minefield and cut a safe path following armour. The US forces preferred the mine-destroying Aunt Jemima, crushing the ground beneath her heavy wheels and exploding mines by pressure. The M4 was adapted to carry the American 105mm howitzer. This weapon also appeared on a Sherman chassis as a self-propelled gun, called the Priest, referring to the high position of the machine gun. The British used their 25-pounder in a similar self-propelled role, referred to as the Sexton. Running short of troop carriers that offered good protection, the British in Italy converted Canadian Shermans into rams to carry 10 infantrymen. Later in France, some of the Sextons had their guns removed, carried infantry, and were nicknamed Holy Rollers. The British again adapted the main body of the M4 and built a Beach ARV version to deal with stranded or damaged vehicles during the Normandy landings. Recovery of immobilized tanks on the battlefield was a necessity, and the M4 provided a good platform for such adaptations. Generally, when away from the fighting, soft-skinned trucks such as the Scammell, Diamond T and Ward La France were also employed to recover or tow the Sherman back to a field workshop for repair. Complete turrets, power plants or hull sections could be swapped out or interchanged, sometimes in the field, other times at some of the manufacturing plants in the USA. Bulldozers, rocket launchers, assault guns, bridging units, and more were also produced by the Allies on the M4 chassis. Other M4s were adapted to a more sinister role as flamethrowers, designed to winkle out a more and more desperate enemy, both in Europe and the Pacific. In the Pacific theatre, Shermans were used in close ground support with the American Marines as they hopped from island to island towards the final objective of the Japanese mainland. M4s were waterproofed and fitted with wading equipment, high intake and exhaust vents to keep the Pacific surf out of the engine bay as they waded ashore from their tank landing craft. Often they went straight into action with no time to remove the vents. The soft beaches and boggy jungle sometimes caused sinking problems, and the fitting of the wider duck grousers helped the tank gain traction. The Japanese possessed few tanks of any size or power. Those that did make an appearance were quickly dealt with by the Sherman. In this theatre at least, the relatively thin armour of the M4 and its 75mm gun met little difficult opposition. The tank could at last fulfil the role prescribed for it in the late 30s as an infantry support vehicle, and the Marines used it well. The Japanese defended these islands with fanatical tenacity. Frequently, they were able to attack the Marines from well-protected and hidden machine gun nests and mortar positions. The heavy jungle provided excellent cover to ambush and pick off the advancing troops as they made their way inland. Often the Japanese were holed up in caves or networks of underground bunkers, which were very costly to assault and almost impervious to air and land bombardment. These emplacements inflicted grievous casualties on the US Marines, and the suicidal defense quickly made the US troops very battle-hardened. In Northern Europe, the Great Crusade continued. The British and Canadians in Normandy struggled through the hedgerow country. The heavily defended city of Caen sucked in German and British armour in a grinding battle of attrition. Several crack German divisions, such as the fanatical Hitlerjugend and heavy panzer regiments with their Tigers, refused stubbornly to give up ground, despite horrendous casualties. Further west, the rapidly advancing Third Army under General Patton began liberating the Cherbourg Peninsula and parts of Brittany. After helping repulse the German 7th Army counterattack at Mortain, the Third Army with its Shermans hooked around and sped eastward, trying to encircle the fleeing German army, desperately trying to make its way to the safety of the other side of the River Seine. In an effort to break out of the Caen bottleneck and head south, the British drew up a series of set-piece battles which made great use of the Sherman, as well as the British Cromwell and Churchill. Operations such as Epsom, Goodwood and Totalize ground to an agonizing halt as Sherman after Sherman was brewed up, either at long range in the open fields or in close quarter fighting in the hedgerows as they neared German defences, which were well camouflaged on high ground overlooking the advance. Time and time again, they fell easy prey to the longer range and hitting power of the dug-in German guns. Operation Totalize saw the first major use of the Sherman as an armoured personnel carrier. A number of Sherman sextons and priests had their main weapon removed and were converted to carry infantry, accompanying the armoured thrusts. These proved very successful in keeping down the PBI casualty numbers and were welcomed as holy rollers or unfrocked priests by their passengers. Despite some innovative tactics, massive air support and bombardments, casualties overall were high. In some instances, the action lasted a few minutes, leaving whole troops of Sherman spouting black smoke from their hastily opened hatches. The open fields in the area south of Caen was strewn with wrecked and burning Shermans, their crews consigned to a fiery death inside the tank, or desperately seeking cover in the high corn and ditches. A bailed-out crew could expect a quick turnaround and be back in action in another Sherman within a couple of days. Such was the availability of supply. A situation the German army could not dare to hope to achieve. Eventually, the Falaise or Chamois Gap was closed. The Shermans of the Polish army pushed south, fighting a ferocious muzzle-to-muzzle battle with a desperate German opposition. The Shermans of General Patton's 3rd US Army drove north and trapped the shattered remnants of the German 7th Army. The carnage of the Falaise Gap is legendary. The Sherman tank played its role in helping shorten the war. In the Pacific, the US Marines fought their way up the island chains towards Japan, getting increasingly closer and establishing bigger airfields for the B-29s to bomb the Japanese mainland. The Shermans are almost always landed immediately after the first wave to help the ground troops move inland off the beach and take the fight to the enemy. As the islands assaulted like Saipan became bigger, so did the size of the battles, and soon the Shermans were being deployed in large numbers. Imperial Japan also faced other enemies in Indochina who used M4s to prosecute their war against the Japanese aggressor. On Manila, troops of Shermans were deployed to clear the capital of Japanese defenders, even taking the battle to those who holed up in the sports arena. The historic Battle of Iwo Jima is enshrined in Marines history, and over 100 Shermans played their part in this. The M4 was used to great effect on these occasions as a flamethrower, squirting a deadly jet of high-pressure inflammable fluid into the bunker opening. The occupants were either instantly burned to death or suffocated as the oxygen was sucked out of their bunker. Sustained and aggressive use of the M4 brought the US Army and Air Force to within striking distance of Tokyo. After the liberation of Paris, the Allies began the long haul across northern Europe to the heart of Nazi Germany in Berlin. Any hope of a swift end to the war was halted by determined and constant German resistance. The Allies ground on with their M4s from river to river, town to town, country to country, season by bitter season. The M4 Sherman was used extensively, adapted frequently, and became the workhorse of the advancing Allied armies. Its universal presence made it one of the most enduring images of World War II. Okinawa was the last bastion of the Imperial Army's defences before the Japanese mainland. If anything, the ferocity of the Japanese defence intensified with their backs to their homeland. The full fury of the American assault included many Shermans, tank destroyers and assault guns. The fighting was bitter to the last. American troops, appalled by the fanaticism of their enemy, took no chances and grimly kept advancing as the Japanese defense gradually weakened in the face of overwhelming odds. The Sherman had helped bring war in the Pacific back to the very shores that had launched it 4 years previously. By the end of World War II, the arsenal of democracy had produced over 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks in different variations. Better tanks such as the Chaffee and Pershing were brought into the US forces and Sherman production was wound down. The manufacturing giants of America returned to civilian car and train production. However, the story of the M4 does not end with the cessation of hostilities in 1945. The balance of global power had changed dramatically. The production might of the USA had now firmly positioned America as one of the leading superpowers on the world stage. Lesser nations lacked the resources to build up their own depleted armed forces, and so the M4, having embraced most of the requirements for a medium tank and having proved itself reliable and adaptable, was purchased from ex-military stockpiles for a number of years. It became the mainstay of many nations' armies in countries as far apart as Canada, the Philippines and India. The Korean War in 1953 saw the familiar Sherman in use again by various nations. Refitted and adapted, but still a Sherman. In Korea, the Allied forces made use of local superstitions, painting fearsome tigers and snarling teeth on the glacis plates of their Shermans, now upgraded with HVSS suspension units and bigger guns. The emergent state of Israel purchased several for its first war of independence, and subsequently refitted many more for the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur conflict. The success of the M4 lay not in individual engineering excellence, rather in a collective ability to do most of the things expected of it well enough. The Allies took the concept of total warfare and produced a tank which was adequate and flexible enough for most operations, but more importantly, could be produced in great numbers. The arsenal of democracy had mass-produced a weapon to meet the threat of its times. A weapon that found itself fighting in every quadrant of the globe, long after its initial conflict had been resolved.
Well, I'm the whole machine gunner, or also the assistant driver. I normally look after the 30 caliber machine gun, fires 500 rounds a minute. I'm wearing what the British Army called pixie suit in 1944, wearing standard issue armour core goggles, holster, 38, 6-shot. Normally help out also passing ammunition to the gunner when he gets a bit short in the turret.
Right, I'm in the position of the tank commander. I generally keep an eye on what's going on, shout instructions to the driver, and just generally make sure that everything is okay.
Well, the three of us are actually representing standard infantry, wearing standard British battle dress from the period about 1942 to the end of the war, worn by all British infantry, British armoured, basically every British Army unit. From the top to the bottom you've got a steel helmet, in this case camouflage, a bit of Hessian scrim. We've got 37 pattern webbing, which will contain various ammunition supplies for the weapon you're carrying, 303 bandoliers in the case of the rifle, Bren magazines in the case of the Bren gun. And also on the back of the equipment we've got anti-gas respirator, anti-gas cape. Although the threat of gas had actually gone pretty much by 1944, they still continued to carry the equipment. The gas cape mainly to be used as a waterproof. Water bottle, entrenching tool, small pack with personal kit, spare rations, spare ammunition, ground sheet, spare socks. Weapons wise, standard Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle, 303, 10-shot, based on a First World War design but simplified for the Second. The Bren light machine gun, introduced 1937, again the 303, same ammunition, except this came in the magazines, of which all the members of the platoon would carry spare magazines for the Bren gun because it was the standard weapon. I myself have got a Sten gun, 9mm, just sprayed a bit of ammunition around and made a bit of noise. Very good for house clearing, and again in Burma they used it for jungle warfare, that sort of thing. And that's about it.